In Africa or abroad, the library is open. You're welcome. What started as one person's love for reading has evolved into a library curating literature from Africa and beyond.
In recent years, the movement to return stolen artifacts to African museums has generated much debate, but missing from this are the great works of Africa's literary heritage. Who owns Africa's multifarious narratives?
The Library of Africa and the African Diaspora, LOATAD in Ghana's capital Accra, is more than just a library. It's also an archive of rare and exclusive first edition copies of literature from across Africa and its diaspora, including literature from Black writers from around the world.
How I see Africa and how I see Blackness is in its totality. And I think it's important because our history and our literature has been very scattered, and not even just scattered, but I would say repressed as well. And I think it's important to show that we are more than people say we are, and maybe even more than who we think we are.
The library's founder, Sylvia Arthur, will tell us more about her push to preserve Africa's written and oral stories. And going once, going twice.
I think it's probably an overreaction of tourists as well.
A town in Japan is about to part ways with one of its most iconic looks. We'll tell you why. This is the A55 podcast. I'm Nia Krofi Smatabe. Hello and welcome to another episode of the A55 podcast. It's great to be back with you all again. I'm so excited because today we get to talk about books, which have been and continue to be a big part of my life. So if you're a lover of books as well, then this episode is for you. I'd love to get your feedback on this and our previous conversations. You can leave a review for us on Apple Podcasts or on our social media pages. We're at A55Pod on X and Instagram, and A55 Podcast is how you'll find us on Facebook. Time now for our proverb of the week. Here's Gertrude Davison Tete with one from Malawi.
A hyena does not change its paths even if it moves to a different forest.
Thanks, Gertrude. In the immortal words of the award-winning American TV personality RuPaul Charles, reading is fundamental. Whereas television shows us images of the world around us, be it through shows, films, or the news, literature opens up the world to us in ways that go beyond the visual. Take science fiction books, for instance. The writers of these stories take us to imagine worlds that don't exist, yet through the power of imagination, we the readers suddenly get a clear picture of this totally made-up world. Through non-fiction books, we get to live the pains and joys of people we love and admire. As a child, I read a lot. I read everything from novels to newspapers to my mother's cookbooks. And I know there are lots of people out there who read a lot as children, and many still do read volumes of books today. One of them is my guest on today's episode, Sylvia Arthur. The great thing about buying your own copy of a book or magazine is that it's yours forever, or for as long as you want to keep it. You can reread it multiple times, and there's no need to rush through it as you probably might have to do if you borrowed it from someone or from the library. The downside to owning lots of books, say over 1,000 of them to be exact, is where to keep them. That was the dilemma Sylvia Arthur faced when she lived and worked in Brussels. After years of buying and reading books, she had over 1,000 copies that needed a new space to live and thrive, so she kept sending them home to her mother in Ghana. And when she packed up her life in England and moved to Ghana, she knew she wanted to share the knowledge in these books with others. Besides that, she also knew the books could fill a gap that she had noticed on the Ghanaian literary scene, the death of books by Ghanaian and other African authors in bookstores. So she set up what we know today as the Library of Africa and the African Diaspora, or LOATAD, in Ghana's capital Accra. But what was she hoping to achieve with this library? And is the space open to only book lovers, or is it open to just about everyone? Sylvia Arthur joins me shortly to tell us more about this. Sylvia, thank you very much for joining us on the A55 podcast.
Thank you for inviting me.
Let's start with a bit of a background as to how the Library of Africa and the African diaspora came to be. And you actually were working in corporate communications, if I get it correctly, in Europe.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so when you were packing up to move to Ghana in I think 2017 was there any thought at all, any idea at all that you were going to set up what today we know as the Library of Africa and the African Diaspora?
Yes, actually, the thought was at the forefront of my mind. I had moved from London to Brussels in 2011 or 2010, actually. And I was working, as you say, in corporate communications. And I'm actually born and raised in London, but of Ghanaian heritage. And so when I moved to Brussels, it was the first time that I'd actually lived outside the UK. And so I have always been a reader. And when I was in Brussels, I was reading a lot because it was a city that I didn't know, with people I didn't really know at all. And the thing about Brussels is it's a very transient city. And so you have lots of people who are coming from all over Europe, and they're coming to work for a short time, and they are readers as well. And so they wouldn't be able to take their books back home with them to wherever they were going. And they would sell them to a secondhand bookshop in Brussels called Pell Mell. And every Saturday I would go there and I would be buying lots of books, particularly books by writers of African descent, and I would be reading them. And the books became too many to accommodate in my flat in London and too many to accommodate in my flat in Brussels. So I would ship them to my mum's house in Kumasi in southern central Ghana. And every time I would go back or I would go to Ghana and to see my mum or to see the house, and I would see the books just sitting there being unread. So I actually had the idea for the library back in 2011, but it wasn't until 2017 that I actually moved from the UK to Ghana that it became a reality. Okay. And that's how the idea came about.
That's interesting. And then also you actually did start it with, I read that about 1,300 books of your own was how you started.
Yes.
Why was it important for you to set up a library with these 1,300 personal books?
Yeah, I mean, every country that I've traveled to, and with my job, I traveled a lot. Every country that I traveled to, I always look for the writers, and I look for the books that are written by people from those countries. Whereas whenever I traveled to Ghana, I found it very difficult to access books by Ghanaian writers, even within Ghana. And I would say, especially within Ghana, it was probably easier for me to get books by, like an Amata Edu or an Aikwe Amar from the UK or from America or from wherever. But when I got to Ghana, trying to find those books was really, really difficult. And I found that to be quite strange and quite, even alienating, I would say, because I thought if even I can't get hold of those books, then what must it be like for people in Ghana who may or may not be interested in reading, but maybe they've never even had the chance to read, works by writers that look like them. And that was what was really driving me, actually, because, I would go to bookshops in Ghana and, they would have all these books like, the 10-Day MBA or Danielle Steele or, some Christian books and, all those kind of things, but they wouldn't really have any fiction or any narrative nonfiction. And what I soon learned, having spent time in Ghana, was that people thought that books were for academia. And they didn't really think that, why should you spend your time reading if you're not at school or at university? Like, what purpose does it have? And that's really why I set up the library, to show that there were books out there that, you should want to read as a form of, leisure activity, escapism, education, whatever the reason is, there's reasons to read beyond academia.
When I was growing up younger in Ghana, I can't even tell how many times I went into a library, until at least I think when I was doing my diploma in journalism was when I started using the school's library for the first time, because really, I didn't think there was anything in the library for me to read or to use.
Yeah. I went to a school library in Ghana pretty early on after I moved there in 2017. I was introduced to a school called Gemstar, which is in Ashaiman. And the reason why this young lady took me there in particular was because she had read about the library. And this school, Gemstar, was set up by a woman called Auntie Grace. She built it herself, and it was a skeleton building, you know. Half of it was in her house, in the compound of her house. And, you know, this isn't a rich woman. It wasn't a big compound, but she had like lots of kindergarten children there. And this young lady took me there because they didn't really have a library. And so when I went there, I think they had been donated 15 Kindles by a charity, 15 Kindles between about 450 children. Yeah. What books they did have were just very, I don't even know how to say it. They weren't calling out to be read. You know, they were very old and, you know, donated by wherever they were donated from. And so she thought that it would be a good fit, you know, for us to go there and see what we could do in terms of the library there. And so we donated like a couple of hundred books, maybe 300 books or so. And Auntie Grace gave us a room that we could set up as a library at the school. And, you know, I'm telling you, the way that the children devoured those books, because these were books that were culturally relevant. They had interesting stories. You know, some of them were, you know, books that were movies had been based on. So they'd seen the movies and they were like, wow, you know, I didn't know this was they didn't know it was a book, and they didn't know that the book came before the movie. And so, you know, all those things led them to really engage with books and reading in a way that they hadn't before. And I think that proves, you know, the point. It proves my point. If you give people, whether children, whether young people, whether adults, you know, things of interest to read, things that are relevant to them to read, things that are relevant to the world to read, they will read. We also have a library in Nsutem in the eastern region, which was actually a collaboration between ourselves, the Library of Africa and the African Diaspora, and Austrian architectural NGO, which is called Archifair, and then the Ghanaian natural earth construction company, Hive Earth. And so Archifair and Hive Earth built the library using sustainable materials from scratch. And we, LOATAD, donated the books to the library and also helped set up the infrastructure in terms of the management of the library and training the staff. And that's really, you know, it was a big step for us because it's a self-sustaining library. It's not within a school. It's not under our immediate control. It's within a community of about 5,000 people that now have access to those books. And it's, as I said, it's a sustainable building as well. So it's definitely going in the direction of where we see, you know, future libraries going in Ghana. And we see it as a model for the development of future libraries in the country and also elsewhere on the continent as well.
Even though I'd never, like I said, I never visited a library until during tertiary education, I was always reading. Enid Blyton, of course, and Invisible Man, Charles Dickens, and Cole. I was reading them, but you know, they were not things that were originally written for me.
And that's okay. That's okay
it is. I mean, it gives you another picture of the other side of the world that you haven't been to at the end.
Exactly. Exactly. But I think the problem that I found in Ghana was that it was only giving a picture of that side of the world. And it was not, you know, life in Ghana or life in Africa or life in the Black diaspora. And so that was the problem. It wasn't evenly balanced. And, you know, the idea of the library was to give that balance so that, you know, children aren't just reading Enid Blyton and Charles Dickens, but they are reading, you know, like a Mallory Blackman, who's a Black British writer, for example, or, you know, somebody who they can relate to and who can relate to them. You know, they're not just reading about snow in somewhere in America that, you know, they may not be able to relate to.
Yeah. And one thing I picked up in preparing for our conversation is what I believe is intentional decision to include books by not only Africa, because usually when we talk about the diaspora as Africans, we think of Africans who are either born or live outside of the African continent. But your library includes books by anyone of African descent as well. Why was that decision important for you?
Yeah. You know, you said it. I'm a diasporan in terms of I was born outside of Africa, but I am obviously very directly because only one generation removed. But how I see Africa and how I see Blackness is in its totality. And so that means, as we say at the library, we have books by writers of African descent, meaning writers from the African continent, writers from the Americas, for example, writers from Europe, from the Caribbean, from wherever there are people of African descent. And I think it's important because, as I alluded to earlier, our history and our literature has been very scattered, and not even just scattered, but I would say repressed as well. And I think it's important to show that we are more than people say we are, and maybe even more than who we think we are, that we have a very long and deep literary heritage. And if you think of slavery and colonialism, for example, one of the justifications for enslaving African people was, that we are not a civilized people, we don't have a written language, and, many kinds of things about our intellect has been said. And I think it's really important to show, as I said, the scope and the diversity and the lineage and the length of history of our intellectual works. And so that's why the library is very much the Library of Africa and the African Diaspora. And, where better placed for a Library of Africa and the African Diaspora than Ghana, which is obviously known as the home of Pan-Africanism.
Okay. And you had a TEDx talk in, I think, 2019, at least that's the date I saw in the video. And you said something that intrigued me. You said, and I quote, in order for us to fully
embrace literature as our own, we must not only see ourselves in books, but we must understand that our literary heritage is broad and deep, that literature and storytelling belong to us and is in our blood.
Of course, when you talk about storytelling, a lot of us Africans, we know and we grew up with the oral tradition of storytelling, so we're used to that. But you saying that we need to understand that literature is in our DNA, I found that really interesting, and I was wondering if you could expand a little bit on that.
Yeah, as you just mentioned, when we speak of Africa and we speak of storytelling, we speak of the oral. And yes, it's true, obviously, our traditions, our history has been passed on orally. However, I think we speak about the oral to the detriment of the literary. And we have been led to believe that, Black people and people of African descent are not writers. We're not literary people because we are oral people. And as far as I'm concerned, that's not the case. It doesn't have to be one or the other. Both can exist at the same time. We can be storytellers orally, and we can also be storytellers in terms of the written word. And I mean, one thing about the library is, I think libraries are by their nature quite exclusive places, especially when you're in a country where maybe literacy is not as high as it is in other places. So you have a library and you're expecting people to come in and automatically be at home there. And I found out very early on that we would have to do a lot more kind of outreach and sensitization and be sensitive ourselves to why people may be reluctant to come into a place that's just full of the written word. And so one thing that we did was we got funding to do a small project where we traveled along the coast of Ghana. And we interviewed women about their stories, about their life stories. And we also asked them if they could tell us a story that they were told and this was all oral and it was recorded. And the reason behind that was to bring the oral into the written space of the library so that people could feel like they could come in and not just be surrounded by books, but be surrounded by, stories that are spoken as well. And another thing that we did in that vein was we've always had lots and lots of events at the library that are probably not traditionally associated with a library and with a written space. So we had an event it's called Music That Matters, where we've brought in musicians who are kind of outside the mainstream, and they tend to sing in their native language. And they tend to be storytellers in their lyrics as well. And so we've had them come into the library and perform live. We've had film screenings, we've had talks and debates, we've had theatre kind of performances, we've had all kinds of things, because we understand that not everybody is comfortable within the library space, but what you find is that everybody is comfortable with storytelling. And so it's about how you frame that.
Yeah.
And so,
And the reason why I said I found that quote particularly moving and curious to me was also because, having lived in the US for a while now, we're in a time where there's a lot of talk about representation and how it matters to, especially people of color, to see themselves in the written word as well. So hearing you talk about also not just that, but also as understanding that, we also have a place in the written word was, something that it jumped at me like, oh wow, yeah, I haven't really thought about that, in that sense before.
yeah. I think many people haven't thought about us having a place in the written word, to our detriment, actually. And I think we miss out a lot when we, focus exclusively. And sometimes it's us, but a lot of times it's, the kind of social conditioning about us that we are an oral people. And, orality is all that matters. And I think it's about not necessarily breaking that idea, because I think it's a true idea, but it's also about saying, yes, we're oral people, but we're also written people as well. And look at what we've done in literature as well.
Absolutely. And you actually jumped to one of the questions I was going to ask, which was the Women's Oral Project. You've spoken about it a bit. And I'm just wondering, so when you record these stories, how did they become part of the library project? Are they available for people to listen? Are you going to transcribe them and print them out? What's the plan with that one?
Yeah, so we've done all that. They are available to listen to online via our SoundCloud page, which sounds very ancient now with SoundCloud. But maybe we'll probably migrate it over to a different platform. But it was on our SoundCloud. It is on our SoundCloud. We also do have the transcripts as well. And also, when you come into the library, we have a listening booth, so you can go in there and listen to the stories. And we also have pictures of the women as well, so you can go in there, you can listen to the women, you could also read the transcripts if you like, and you could be surrounded by their images and see the person behind the story. And these are often people who have never been asked their stories before.
You also have children's projects, you have Afrofuturism project, and one thing I read, because a lot of the stories I read about the library was, I think, either during COVID or immediately before COVID, was you wanted to start residencies. I wonder, has it finally kicked off?
Yeah, the residencies are actually our main work right now. And so since 2022, we've had just over 50 writers come from all over Africa and the African diaspora to come and be in residence with us. We were slightly curtailed by COVID because we had originally intended to start with the residencies in 2021. But in 2021, we received a grant from the ACP EU, the European Union Promotion for West African Culture Fund. And they allowed us to host, or that funding allowed us to host 18 writers from across West Africa. And so we received over 200 or so applications from writers from all across the region. And from those, we selected 18. And so that was in 2022. We also ran that program again last year with 8 writers from across West Africa. And this year, actually, in 2024, we are running our LOATAD Black Atlantic residency, which was generously supported by the Hawthornden Foundation. And that allows us to host 12 writers from across Africa and the African diaspora. So that's what's really cool about it and unique about it, is that we're bringing together people who have always been special to us. In fact, in that they're even in the name of the library, as you said, Library of Africa and the African Diaspora. So it's the first time that we've been able to bring writers together from across the diaspora to Ghana with writers from Africa and from the continent to be in community together. And they are considering the question, what is Africa to me? In the context of the Black Atlantic. And we've had writers from Brazil, we've had writers from the United States, we've had writers from Somaliland, Ethiopia, Nigeria, Ghana, all over. And it's just been amazing.
Awesome. And I remember one thing you said in one of your interviews about bring a book, leave a legacy, especially to those of us currently in the diaspora. Is that still something you're championing? And if so, if, say, I'm visiting home and I want to bring some books to donate to the library, what book works for LOATAD? Because you have, how many books do you have now? I'm sure you have over 5,000 books. So what book do I bring?
I mean, last count was about 4,000, but we're always open to receiving books, especially books by writers of African descent. So that's writers from the African continent, the Americas, the Caribbean, Europe, wherever there are writers of African descent. And we don't have everything, but even if we have many books, even if we have a lot of books, we also have our little LOATAD library, which is the one in Ashaiman, which is the school library. So if you donate any book that is for children or young people, we will receive it, but then we will disseminate it to our little LOATAD library.
Okay, that's good to know. And does the genre matter, or you take all genres? Fiction, non-fiction?
We take all genres.
Okay.
Yeah, fiction, non-fiction, poetry, plays, scripts. We also take journals and magazines. We were very fortunate, actually, 2 years ago to have been donated a whole collection by an American professor called Professor Ian Munro. And he was a professor of Caribbean and African literature who taught all over the world, including in Africa, in China, and in the United States as well. And so he had a vast collection. And it included not only books, many rare and first editions, because we are also an archive as well, but it also included things like play scripts, academic journals, just such gems, actually. It was something that we would never have been able to acquire by ourselves. So we're very grateful to him and to Brittle Paper and to Aina Hiadoro, who recommended us to receive this collection. But yes, we're open to everything.
Okay, that's good to know. So we'll put it out there, and hopefully you'll be getting more donations in terms of books. And I'll also look through my rather short library. Not as impressive as yours. I don't have 1,300 books yet, but...
No, but you have to start from somewhere.
Absolutely.
And so, never be ashamed of your book collection. At least you have one.
I do. So we'll send some your way as well as time goes on.
Thank you.
Sylvia Arthur, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today.
Thank you for having me.
Now you can check out our show note for links to LOATAD's library, as well as links to Sylvia's TEDx talk for those of you who want to catch the entire presentation. And if you are an avid reader like Sylvia or myself and wondering what to do with the books you've reread a few times, may I interest you in donating them to LOATAD? Now, tourist attractions are meant to draw tourists, right? But the town in Japan seems fed up with the crowds of tourists, and it's taken steps to block one of its now Insta-famous locations. But why? Before You Go is next. And before you go, around the world, countries that have unique or one-of-a-kind locations like to flaunt it, and rightly so. It serves as a source of revenue for the cities or countries, and it creates jobs for people. In fact, there are countries around the world that have tourism as their number one foreign income earner. The Japanese town of Fujikawaguchiko is no stranger to tourism. In fact, the town is built on tourism since it sits at the foothills of the iconic Mount Fuji. Due to the town's location, there are a number of scenic photo spots that offer beautiful views of the iconic Mount Fuji. In the past 2 years, a photo taken in the neighborhood of Fujikawaguchiko blew up on Instagram. And as Insta trends go, the town has since seen an increase in tourist numbers, but the numbers have been particularly high over the past few months. Apparently in that neighborhood, a photo taken at a particular angle shows Mount Fuji in the background appearing to sit atop a local convenience store called Lawson. Cue the Insta phenomenon Mount Fuji Lawson. But the number of visitors seems to be the least on the list of worries for residents. The locals are complaining about the behavior of the foreign tourist. They accuse the tourists of littering, ignoring traffic lights, trespassing into private properties, and even crowding the sidewalks, according to a report by the Associated Press or AP.
This spot isn't meant for tourists. but then there's like in TikTok and everything, there's influx of people coming in.
The town's authorities have tried different methods to keep the foreign tourist in check. They've made signs in different languages urging tourists to use designated crossings. Heck, they've even hired private security for crowd control, but none seems to have worked. So, at the end of last month, the town's authorities resolved to build a fence to block the view of Mount Fuji. The fence, which is being made with a black mesh net, will stand at 2.5 meters or 8.2 feet high and 20 meters or 65 feet long, and it's expected to completely block the view of Mount Fuji.
It's understandable what they're about to do. Regrettable, but it's understandable.
One local resident told the Associated Press that tourists start trooping to the neighborhood as early as 4 a.m.
I noticed today that Mount Fuji's not even in the view and people are still taking pictures. So that's the power of social media, I think.
Now, that got me questioning how we experience tourism today. Just last month, Namibians were outraged by 3 men, foreign tourists at that, posing naked for photographs on the famous Big Daddy Dune in the Namibian desert. It seems to me that while social media is helping us discover new tourist destinations thanks to influencers and everyday people who post about them, the allure to these sites leading to overcrowding. And the people who live in these tourist locations are not particularly enthused about it, especially about the mess tourists seem to leave behind. So what's the way out? Maybe tourist destinations that are dealing with overcrowding might all borrow a page from Venice's book and start charging tourists an additional fee to explore their towns or cities. I'm not sure how happy tourists would be about that, but hey, that may reduce the numbers, right? I don't know if the so-called revenge travel post-COVID is still a thing, but if it is, I mean, come on. Mount Fuji isn't going anywhere, at least not for now and not for a while, so why rush to see it now? I think the best way to enjoy a country or tourist spot to the fullest amid this craze is probably to wait to visit these places in the off-season if there's one. Anyway, that's our show for today. A big thank you to Sylvia Arthur for joining us on the show. Special thanks to my producer Gertrude Davison Tete and my social media coordinator Bright Drab. And don't forget to rate our show and leave us a comment or review. I'm Nia Krofi Smatabe. Have a good weekend and we'll talk soon.